Niagara Falls, masterpiece of nature, asterisk, from the very first moment you hear it, you understand. A deep, thunderous roar, rising from the earth, echoing across the horizon. A curtain of white mist climbing into the sky. And then, before your eyes, the sight of power and beauty combined, the majestic Niagara Falls, straddling to nations, flowing between Ontario in Canada and New York in the United States. This natural wonder is more than a waterfall. It is a living symbol of the raw force of nature, of human history, of connection across borders, and of the timeless rhythm of water itself. But to truly understand Niagara, we must travel far back in time, to an age when the world was still forming. The story of Niagara begins not in the modern era, but over 12,000 years ago, in the shadow of the Ice Age, as massive sheets of ice covered much of North America. Glaciers advanced and retreated, reshaping the land with their slow but unstoppable movement. When the last great glacier melted, it left behind an enormous inland sea, the Great Lakes. Among them, Lake Erie and Lake Ontario were carved by ice, stone, and water, and the flow between them sought a path. That path would eventually become the Niagara River. In those early millennia, the river began its journey northward, tumbling over cliffs of ancient limestone and shale. This was the birth of Niagara Falls. But the falls we see today are not where they began. Over 12,000 years, the relentless force of water has eroded the rock, cutting a gorge nearly 11 kilometers long. Slowly, steadily, the falls have migrated upstream, leaving behind a scar of stone, a timeline written in earth itself. Even today, the falls retreat at an average of 30 centimeters per year. A reminder that this wonder is not fixed, but alive, forever changing, forever in motion. Yet, long before explorers, before industry, before tourism, there were people who looked upon Niagara with awe. For the Haudenosaunee, the Iroquois Confederacy, and other indigenous nations, Niagara was sacred. They called it Niagara, believed to mean thundering waters. For them, this was no ordinary river. It was the lifeblood of the land, a place of spiritual power, of stories, of legends. One such legend speaks of Lilawella, the Maid of the Mist, a young woman who, in despair, set herself adrift on the river, only to be carried toward the falls. As her canoe plunged over the edge, she was caught by the thunder god, Hinnom, who dwelt beneath the cataract. In his world of eternal mist, she found new life and became a spirit guardian of the falls. For centuries, indigenous peoples passed down these stories, reminding all who came after them that Niagara was more than water. It was spirit to the Haudenosaunee. The falls were a place of ceremony and vision. The endless mist was seen as a veil between worlds, a threshold between the earthly and the divine. Standing before the thundering waters, they did not merely see erosion and stone, but the very breath of creation. And so, when European explorers first set eyes on Niagara in the 17th century, they entered a world already sacred, already alive with meaning. In 1678, Father Louis Hennepin, a French missionary, became the first European to describe Niagara Falls in writing. He wrote of its immensity, of the staggering drop, of the deafening sound words that would inspire wonder across Europe. Hennepin's descriptions, though exaggerated, placed Niagara firmly in the imagination of the Old World. Artists painted it, writers praised it. The thundering waters became a symbol of the New World's untamed majesty. But for indigenous nations, the coming of Europeans brought not wonder, but upheaval. The falls, once a place of ceremony, now stood at the crossroads of empire. The French, the British, and later the Americans all recognized the strategic importance of the Niagara River. It was not only a natural wonder, but a vital waterway, the key to trade, transportation, and control of the Great Lakes. By the 18th century, forts rose on either side of the river. Fort Niagara to the north, guarding the mouth where the river enters Lake Ontario, and later Fort George and Fort Erie. These were not built to admire the falls, but to control them. For in the age of empire, whoever held Niagara held the gateway to the heart of a continent. And yet, through wars, treaties, and shifting borders, the falls continued their eternal plunge, indifferent to human struggle. Nations fought, flags changed, but the thunder of Niagara never ceased. Today, when we stand before the falls, gazing across the misty divide between Canada and the United States, we are reminded that this place has always been more than just geography. It is nature's stage, where stories of earth, of people, of nations, all converge. And so begins our journey. A journey not only through time and geology, but through culture, history, industry, and imagination. From its icy birth to its role as a symbol of power, romance, and inspiration, Niagara Falls is a wonder we cannot merely see. It is one we must feel. As the 18th century unfolded, the Niagara frontier became one of the most contested places in North America. The thundering river that divided two lakes was not simply a natural marvel. It was a corridor of power. Whoever commanded the Niagara corridor commanded the trade routes of the Great Lakes, and in the struggles between empires, Niagara became a prize worth fighting for. During the French and Indian War, rival flags rose and fell over the forts that guarded the river. At Fort Niagara, the French resisted British forces until 1759, when, after weeks of siege, they surrendered, forever changing the destiny of the region. With the Treaty of Paris in 1763, Britain claimed dominion over these waters, but their grip would not last long. The American Revolution soon followed, and the Niagara River once again became a frontier of fire. Battles were fought along its banks. Alliances were forged and broken with indigenous nations, and families were divided across its rushing waters. The War of 1812 brought some of the bloodiest encounters in the region's history. At Queenston Heights, just north of the falls, British and Canadian forces clashed with Americans in a desperate battle, one that ended with the death of General Isaac Brock, today remembered as a hero of Canada. At Lundy's Lane, near the roar of the cataract itself, one of the fiercest battles of the war raged, with cannon fire echoing against the thunder of the falls. These were years when Niagara's waters bore witness to conflict, when the land itself was scarred by fire and steel, and yet, through these storms of war, the falls remained. The mist still rose, the waters still thundered, reminding all who came near that human struggles were fleeting compared to the eternal rhythm of nature. By the mid-19th century, peace gradually settled across the border. The United States and Canada, then still part of the British Empire, no longer saw Niagara as a battleground, but as a shared wonder. For as the Industrial Revolution swept across the continent, people began to look at Niagara not just as a frontier of empire, but as a place of inspiration and opportunity. The falls became a magnet for artists, poets, and dreamers. Painters sought to capture its sublime power on canvas, while writers described its grandeur in words that reached across oceans. Charles Dickens, visiting in 1842, declared that nothing he had ever seen approached Niagara's majesty. The roar of the falls, the rainbow-hued mist, the sense of standing before something eternal. It inspired not just awe, but reflection. For Victorians, Niagara symbolized the sublime, the meeting of beauty and terror, where nature's power overwhelmed the human senses. At the same time, the falls began to attract another kind of traveler, tourists. By the 1820s and 30s, Niagara had earned its reputation as the honeymoon capital of the world. Newlyweds from Europe and America made pilgrimages to the falls, their carriages rumbling down dusty roads, their letters home filled with descriptions of misty mornings and moonlit rainbows. By the time railroads arrived in the mid-19th century, Niagara's fame had spread worldwide. Hotels rose on both sides of the river, offering visitors grand views from their balconies. Carriages carried travelers down to the river's edge, where boatmen ferried them into the mist. In 1846, the Maid of the Mist launched her first voyage, carrying passengers daring enough to sail toward the thundering base of Horseshoe Falls. The experience, terrifying yet exhilarating, became a rite of passage for generations of visitors. But as crowds grew, so too did problems. By the mid-19th century, Niagara was in danger of being loved to death. Entrepreneurs built fences, charged fees, and littered the landscape with crude attractions. Hawkers sold trinkets, taverns spilled into the streets, and speculators seized land along the riverbanks. What had once been a sacred place risked becoming a carnival of commerce. Writers and conservationists lamented the decline of Niagara's dignity, calling for protection before it was lost forever. At the same time, another force was eyeing Niagara's waters industry. For centuries, the river had flowed untamed, its energy crashing uselessly into the gorge. But with the advent of hydroelectric technology, visionaries saw a new future, the power of Niagara harnessed for human progress. In 1881, the first commercial hydroelectric station opened on the American side, using direct current to power streetlights in Niagara Falls, New York. Soon after, engineers and investors dreamed bigger. Among them was Nikola Tesla, whose alternating current system, backed by George Westinghouse, promised to transmit electricity miles away. Their vision was realized in 1895, when a massive hydroelectric plant opened at Niagara, sending power as far as Buffalo, 26 miles away. It was a revolution. Niagara was no longer just a spectacle, it was a powerhouse. The falls became a symbol, not only of nature's grandeur, but of humanity's ability to channel it and sow. By the turn of the 20th century, Niagara had become many things at once. It was a natural wonder, a tourist mecca, a honeymoon retreat, and an industrial engine of progress. But behind the glitter of electric lights and the laughter of honeymooners, a question lingered. How could such a place, so vast and powerful, be both preserved and used? Could Niagara remain a wonder, even as it became a machine? The answers to those questions would define the next chapter of Niagara's story, a chapter of conservation, spectacle, and transformation, where governments, dreamers, and daredevils all sought their place in the shadow of the thundering waters. As the 19th century drew to a close, Niagara was no longer just a destination for poets, artists, and honeymooners. It had become a stage for ambition, for spectacle, and for those who sought to test themselves against the unyielding power of nature. If Niagara's waters symbolized eternity, they also tempted mortals with the chance of fleeting glory. The daredevils came in 1829. Sam Patch, known as the Yankee Leaper, stunned crowds by jumping into the Niagara River. Below the falls, his leap was reckless, his survival miraculous, and his fame immediate. He became the first in a long line of men and women who would risk everything for a few moments in the roar of the cataract. Decades later, in 1859, a French tightrope walker named Charles Blondin took the spectacle to an entirely new level. Suspended on a rope stretched across the gorge, Blondin walked 1,100 feet above the thundering rapids. Tens of thousands gathered to watch in awe as he crossed not once, but many times blindfolded, pushing a wheelbarrow, even carrying his manager on his back. Blondin transformed Niagara into a theater of the impossible, and others soon followed, attempting their own crossings, their own stunts, their own flirtations with death. The falls became a proving ground, where human courage and folly danced on the edge of survival. Annie Edson Taylor, a 63-year-old schoolteacher, made history in 1901 when she became the first person to go over Horseshoe Falls in a barrel and live. Her survival shocked the world, though fame and fortune eluded her. Others who attempted the same feat were not so fortunate. Barrels, bowls, even makeshift contraptions of wood and steel were tested against the fury of the cataract. Some emerged battered but alive. Others disappeared into the churning depths, never to be seen again. These spectacles fascinated the public. Crowds gathered, newspapers printed sensational accounts, and Niagara's reputation as a place of both romance and danger deepened. The falls were not only a backdrop for love and inspiration, but also for daring and death-defying feats. Niagara became a paradox, a sacred wonder and a circus stage, an eternal natural monument and a playground for human ambition. But while daredevils captured headlines, a quieter, more enduring struggle was taking shape, the fight to preserve Niagara itself. By the late 19th century, many feared that the falls, surrounded by industry, hotels, fences, and gaudy attractions, were being desecrated. The natural beauty that had inspired centuries of wonder was being diminished by unchecked development. Voices rose in protest. Writers, artists, and conservationists called for action, and governments began to take notice. In 1885, Ontario established the Niagara Parks Commission, purchasing land along the river to protect it from exploitation. The same year, New York created the Niagara Reservation, the state's first park, designed by Frederick Law Olmsted, the landscape architect of Central Park. These measures marked the birth of the modern conservation movement in North America. For the first time, Niagara was not just a resource to be used, or a stage for entertainment, but a treasure to be preserved for future generations. The creation of the parks changed the visitor experience. Instead of being harassed by hawkers, or fenced out by private owners, people could once again wander freely along the river's edge, gazing at the falls without obstruction. Pathways and gardens were designed to enhance the natural scenery, not compete with it. The falls were given back to the people, not as a commodity, but as a shared inheritance. This balance between preservation and use was delicate. On one side, the falls were being safeguarded as a wonder of nature. On the other, they were increasingly harnessed as a source of power. Hydroelectric plants multiplied along the riverbanks, feeding the growth of cities and industries. The glow of electric lights in nearby towns and the hum of factories were daily reminders that Niagara was no longer wild, but part of the modern world. Yet the mist still rose. The rainbows still shimmered in the sunlight. The eternal voice of the falls continued, unchanged, even as human hands reshaped the landscape around it. As the 20th century dawned, Niagara stood at a crossroads of identity. Was it a wonder to be preserved, a stage for daring feats, a honeymoon, paradise, or an industrial powerhouse? In truth, it had become all of these at once, and its story was far from over. The decades ahead would bring even greater crowds, bold new feats, and new challenges as Niagara transformed into not just a regional treasure, but a global icon.